welcome to our event. As I said, that the title is pretty provocative, I would have to say. It's provocative, but I think, will President Putin survive until 2024 is a legitimate question. There is a perfect storm of many challenges going on right now to Putin and his presidency. Widespread protests across Russia, many different cities. We have waning support in the polls for his presidency. There are economic difficulties, no question. The COVID pandemic, Russia is trying to manage that and was one of the top countries being affected by COVID. Then there is unrest in the neighborhood, so to speak, in Belarus. And then we can't forget about Ukraine, which continues to be an issue. So to go through all of these questions and to answer the big question of all, we have three really excellent guests. First, we have Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who I think everybody knows is a former political prisoner, the founder of Open Russia. Very glad to have you, sir. And we have former president of Estonia, Toomas Hendrik Ilves. He is the distinguished fellow now at CEPA, at this organization. And then finally, last but not least, we have Alina Polyakova, who is the president and CEO of CEPA. And I'm very glad to say that I know all of them personally. In fact, some of them for many years, and it's great to see you visually, at least virtually, and glad to have a chance to moderate this discussion. So we only have 1 hour. I'm going to pose some questions to get us started. We will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we will open up for many questions. And again, if you can kind of speak slowly. Alina Polyakova, I wanted to start with you because you have kind of an academic think tank, broad sense of what is happening with Russia. And as you look at all of those challenges, realistically, how vulnerable is President Putin?
Well, thank you so much, Jill. It's wonderful to see you as well. And I'm just delighted that we're able to host this conversation. A new thing we're doing at CEPA is the interpretation. So I hope that those of you who are maybe listening in Russian are able to take part in the discussion as well. To go to your question, Jill, the reason we want to have this discussion is exactly because it very much seems to me that President Putin is incredibly vulnerable at this moment, which is perhaps a bit ironic to say, given that the Russian government did just push through these so-called constitutional amendments that de facto allow him to stay in power at least through the 2030s and probably beyond. So it seems initially that his power is quite set, that has been solidified, certainly in Russia domestically. But then if we pan out just a little bit beyond these constitutional reforms, we see that we've had ongoing protests for months in Russia's east, in Khabarovsk, of course. These protests have turned quite political. We have the ongoing protests against Lukashenko in Belarus. Of course, Russia has seen Belarus as very much part of its legitimate so-called sphere of influence, part of its neighborhood. And by losing Ukraine, they can't really afford to lose Belarus now as well. So in some ways, Moscow is fighting a war against authoritarianism and for democracy on both fronts, to its west and to its east. And on top of all that, the global pandemic has affected Russia in profound ways. The Russian economy wasn't doing well already, and certainly the pandemic is making them much worse. Putin's approval ratings have been dropping serendipitously for the last few months, and that's certainly not, I think, something the Kremlin is very happy about. So it's very hard to see a way out of a situation for him when there's so many factors pulling on his own legitimacy, the approval ratings, that are probably opening opportunities for others to ask questions whether he is the so-called, efficient manager that the Kremlin propaganda has made him out to be, or whether when he's really hit with a real crisis that's affecting people's livelihoods, and people speak out against the kind of authoritarianism we've seen in Russia, whether they can really handle it. And I will not speak, I think we'll get to it, of course, on the horrendous act attributed to the Russian government of the poisoning of Russia's main opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. And that, I think, is creating an ongoing and developing diplomatic problem for the Kremlin as well, to say the least. But I think we'll get to talk about the implications of that as we go on.
Mm-hmm. Let me just follow up quickly, because, you know, this idea that President Putin eventually will have to go, maybe sooner than later, has been around for quite a long time, albeit right now we have this enormous, you know, perfect storm. But one of the ideas that some have proposed is that even if Putin goes, the Putin system continues. How do you answer that? What do you think?
Yeah, the sistema, of course, which, you know, refers to this notion that it's not just about sort of the snake's head, it's the whole snake that's really the problem. And certainly, I think in Russia, given the 20 years now that we've seen of Putin, Putinism as a system has come into place in a profound way. But I think you can be pessimistic about it and say, well, no matter who's at the top of government in Russia, things will always stay the same. I think if you look at Ukraine, if you look at other former Soviet states, you see that's not really true. The things can change. It takes longer than we'd like, but things do change. And I think things can and will change in Russia eventually, because the current system is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the Russian people, and it's not sustainable economically as well. So yes, of course, there's that legacy that is deeply embedded. There's a legacy of corruption on which the regime maintains its current hold on power. But these things are not inevitable. It's not inevitable that just because that's the way it is today, this is the way it will always be.
Okay, thank you. President Ilves, I'd like to ask you, again, good to see you again. You have had really a unique vantage point. You've been able, when you were president of Estonia, which of course has a very direct relationship with Russia anyway, but you as president really, you know, met Putin, observed him directly. There were, you really, I think, a unique, and I value that as we have discussed events in the area for many years. Do you think it is an exaggeration to say that he is really vulnerable? Because after all, he's come through some economic crisis. The country is still there. His polls are dropping, but there is still a significant proportion of the country that does support him. So is this an exaggeration? And also, when you evaluate him, what are the specific factors that you look at to make your determination?
Well, first of all, I don't think he can allow himself to leave office. I mean, this is why, I mean, the analogy to the mafia is actually quite appropriate. I mean, it's very difficult for a mafia don to leave, because whoever comes afterwards will kill him. And I think this is the fear of dictators everywhere, which is that they cannot leave office, because of what they have done to maintain power. So I don't see him leaving in any way. Moreover, even if you think that it might be a little more civilized, he needs guarantees that he won't have all his assets taken away from him by people who come next. And that's always a worry in these kinds of authoritarian structures. I mean, there is no mechanism for a peaceful transfer of power, since he keeps pushing it off. And now with this referendum, he has pushed it off again, potentially up to 2036. So I don't see much hope for that. I also don't see that he's weak. I mean, he still has all of the instruments of power, and as we've seen just in the past 4 weeks in Belarus, even if 80% of the population is against you, well, it hasn't dislodged Lukashenko in the least. So I think that I think the major threat to Putin is precisely the sistema, which does not guarantee that it will be a better system or that it will somehow be sort of different once he is replaced. But, you know, as Churchill talked about Kremlinology, it's trying to observe dogs fighting under a rug. There may be, we don't know if there is any dog fighting going on under the rug, but clearly at some point, when he starts slowing down and perhaps making some bigger mistakes, or offending someone in his choice of who to bestow with riches and someone getting left out, that there will be some kind of palace revolt. I think that's kind of inevitable, but when that will happen is hard to say. But I do not see any reasonable way for Putin to leave in the near future as long as he is capable of holding on to the reins of power. And certainly the last thing he would ever want to do, this is to go into contemporary Belarus, is allow any kind of popular revolt in any way threaten his position in power.
Mm. And yet there have been those protests, which are, I think, quite significant. They're happening in cities all over the country. For various reasons, but you have to look at some of the ones, especially in Siberia, that have been really kind of against Moscow and quite a bit of criticism of President Putin. Do you think that they are significant? You know, what do they need?
Well, they have not been treated as significant by Moscow, by the Kremlin. Things, I mean, I think we'll have a better handle on this to see what comes out of the local elections this upcoming weekend, in which there are all kinds of shenanigans going on that invariably have accompanied even local elections under the Putin regime. There are shenanigans with registration to vote and so forth. But it'll be very interesting to see what the outcome of the votes are, and also to see what the level of participation is. I recall the last time there were local elections, they tried everything to prevent independent candidates from registering, and even then we're shocked to see how well they did and how well they performed, despite all of the administrative actions taken against them. So I think that it bears following and to look at what the results are in the municipal elections or the local elections. I mean, they vary from republic level down to very small town level, but they all are so-called local elections. How much, I mean, that is probably an indicator of some kind of sentiment. On the other hand, I mean, Russia is not a federal state. It is so completely centralized, despite being called a federation, that it probably will have very little effect actually on the way things are run.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to Mr. Khodorkovsky. Mikhail Borisovich, I hope you can hear me. Everything working properly?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. There are so many things to ask you because you, of everyone, have a very direct relationship, let's put it that way, with President Putin. You were in a labor camp for a while because of the decision by the government. So you have just published a new book. I have not read the entire book. I've read some atrivki, some little portions of it. And I was intrigued by the title, which is Gardarika, which is, I had to remind myself of medieval Russian history, which is an Old Norse term for the states of Kievan Rus. So we're back there. It's kind of a different type of title, but in it, I did see one quote. You say, one way or another, the regime will end. So what makes you so sure about that?
I would like to greet everyone and grateful for the question you've asked me. All authoritarian regimes always come to an end. Why? Because everyone commits critical errors, both authoritarian and democratic regimes and rulers. And under authoritarian rule, under democracy, the results of a critical error is finally the change of government. But under democracy, it's not a tragedy, but a normal course of events. But under authoritarian rule, it is the end of the regime as we know it. Why would it happen? Why will it happen? Why does this become more and more likely? The entire world, including Russia, is developing too fast at the moment, very fast indeed. The 30-year experience, or even a 10-year experience, often doesn't give you advantages that the flexibility and creativity give you. No point in looking at young ministers of the Putin government. Decisions are in fact taken and propelled by his old friends, his entourage. He trusts them, he understands them, and as a result, the country for the past 6 years has been standing still economically. The highly qualified young people are leaving, his rating is falling. Putin himself is committing more and more dangerous errors. It was difficult to imagine before such a decision as poisoning Navalny or murdering people in England. But such decisions are taken with his silent approval, because the deep state is what he's following very closely. And we understand why he's following and monitoring them very closely, because without a transition of some of the deep state to the side of the opposition, he could remain in power for another many, many years. But today, things could happen overnight, because he is not getting any younger. The situation in the country has ceased to be stable as a result of that. So after this happens, by that moment, it is very important that on all the key issues, we would have a public consensus on all the key issues of future reforms. When I talk about consensus or fundamental consensus or key issues, in my understanding, this means that no one group in the country, I mean a serious camp, a serious group of people, wouldn't be ready to defend an alternative point of view with extreme methods. And their outlook to important alternatives, to decisions, is something that I have put into this new book, Gardarika, that you've just mentioned. And this is why I called it Gardarika, or New Russia, because it is just one of the alternatives to the centralized, Moscow-centered country that we have today. We can have that, or we have Gardarika, a country of mega cities, where there is no one single center which concentrates all the financial or intellectual resources or powers of the country, but there are many centers. So, of course, I am the supporter of Gardarika, because we can see that Moscow is unable to deal with the problems this huge country faces. It can turn into Buenos Aires, but I don't think this is something we would like to happen. There are very important key crossroads. One of them, whether to preserve the presidential post in the future Russia, in future Russia, as a figure that stands over the population, above it. I unequivocally support a parliamentary model for Russia, with the president being part of the executive or turning his post into a ceremonial position. A strong president in a country like Russia with weak institutions will quickly bring us back to authoritarian rule. Unfortunately, we have seen it many times before. Another key issue that we face, Russian society faces today, is where we want to move on to in the direction of empire or national nation state, civil state. I am the proponent of a nation state, but then the republics should have a right to secede. And this is not an easy question for the Russian society, although it's a key one. Another important issue that we have to deal with is the question about the greatness of Russia, the superpowerness of Russia, which means in our case, participating in a huge number of conflicts outside Russia. So are we a superpower, or what is more important, being a superpower or having a national interest? I am for national interests, but this means for Russia refusing to think that it should be afraid of it, that other people should be afraid of it. And for lots of Russians, this is a very painful realization. Another interesting question to ask ourselves, and I think that it is odd, perhaps for an American audience, whether we should have a monopoly or competition. For you and for me, there is no question over this, and yet our society has a variety, a pluralism of views of the importance of competition in sensitive areas. And this is one of the issues that has to be dealt with. Another significant problem for Russia, where again we have to find a national consensus, is where we are moving to socially. The Russian political tradition has it when we go left, which means we have a more socially oriented state. If we're moving right, this means conservatism, American style. For Russia, in my opinion, there is no alternative to the return of the social state, even at the price of losing some economic dynamics. Unfortunately, we have lost too much time here in the social sphere, in the social area, and we cannot afford to be a right-wing conservative country. Another interesting question, which some of the audience might not quite understand, is how we should move to rule of law. This appears to be very simple, but part of Russian society, under the influence of propaganda, identify rule of law with enforcing laws imposed by the regime. And if we look at the laws that we are going to inherit from this regime, we can see that a lot of them are quite extra-legal. They're extra-legal. Even, it's very difficult to even interpret it into English, extra-legal. So they are laws which don't correspond to law, to the rule of law. And this is another problem we will have to deal with. and we'll have to try to decide what we want as a country. And another very important question of lustration. I don't think many should be punished. I think we should only punish the disciples, the direct disciples. The rest should have a broad amnesty. If somebody wants to be an active participant of political life, if they want to participate in a power ministry at a particular level, they have to be vetoed. But we cannot constrain the rights of 20 million people, or we restrain the rights of 20 million. So in my deep conviction, Russian society has to make a choice about its own future. It will have to defend that kind of future. And it will have to be ready to defend it by risking its life. Time and time again, we can see it by the example of Belarus. We can see that outside the threat of use of force, dictators do not leave, they always threaten to use force. If Belarus can demonstrate how they can remove the dictator without using force or the threat of force, or the threat of violence, I would only be happy. This would be a very important lesson for me, a very important model to follow. So far, I haven't seen examples of that non-violent removal of dictators in my life. So these are alternatives I have formulated for Russia. These are my answers. This is what people should be suggesting to society. Any political activist should show their vision to society and try to convince it that this vision is correct. And then we should wait for the answer from society, what their reaction is going to be.
Okay, well, thank you. You obviously, Mikhail Borisovich, have been thinking very deeply about the future and the post-Putin future. And it's very specific, and I think that will be interesting for our participants to follow up with questions about that. I think now, since we're at the halfway point, we will go to questions. And I just want to remind people that if you want to hear the full discussion, again, you have to choose your language, which is down in the bottom right, that globe. Choose your language to make sure that you can hear what you want to hear. And the other thing is asking questions, as has already started in the Q&A function. And English would be much easier. So I'm going to start with a question. It's a very specific question. It is for Mr. Khodorkovsky, and it is not theoretical at all. It's very practical. And here it is. We do not see any protests in support of Alexei Navalny. Why? Also, what effect, if any, protests in Belarus could have?
И протестов в Хабаровске. Это действительно важно для того, чтобы понимать, что на самом деле происходит. Российское общество достаточно инерционно. И те вопросы, которые его реально, практически волнуют, это вопросы, во-первых, социальные. Вот когда в Белоруссии на улице выходила интеллигенция, люди, журналисты, писатели, так сказать, работники IT-индустрии и так далее.
IT specialists, there was nobody particularly worried about it. But when the factories went on strike, that became a serious threat to the regime. And that's when Putin got involved to try and finding solution to the problem, because this is exactly what he's afraid of. Large industries, large enterprises, the left social idea. This is exactly what the present regime is really afraid of. Alexei Navalny is quite a popular figure in Russia. But in terms of compassion, in terms of feeling sorry for him, for what the regime has done to it, of course, yes, there is this compassion among the most educated part of society, but much less compassion among those who really can take to the streets and really would be ready to remove the present regime, to get rid of it. They are much more concerned with social issues. This is why this conflict is still waiting for its resolution.
Okay, well, thank you. And in connection with that, there is another question related, and this is for President Ilves. President Ilves, from your point of view, what response should be taken by the United States and the EU regarding the poisoning of Alexei Navalny? And perhaps this question is, what response do you think are likely that we are going to see? Let's start with the first. What should the response be?
Well, I would, since we're unwilling to do more than sanction, then I would just have better sanctions. But I think we need to actually raise the price on these things. It's a difficult issue when it comes because of Western standards of law. But so far, we've only sanctioned individuals who we know about. But this doesn't have much of an effect if their wives and mistresses continue to travel to their mansions in London and their apartments in Trump Tower, and their kids go to school in the West. I think we ought to extend it to families. Then it begins to bite that, yes, you are really isolated now if you are participating in these kinds of actions. And ultimately, we do know who the major figures are. Do I think they'll do? Oh, and one more thing, of course, I would cancel Nord Stream 2. I mean, if there's ever a reason to do it, given that Germany in any case is in violation of EU rules, just throwing its weight around. But if there's any time to actually cancel Nord Stream 2, this is it. On the second question, what do I think they will do? Little, very little. As we see, too many countries are looking out for an economic advantage. We have seen sort of the reset that proposed by President Macron has now basically fizzed out, but hope springs eternal. And for as long as I've been involved in foreign affairs, I have seen the every new person, be it a foreign minister or a president or a prime minister, think they will be the ones who will finally break through and reset relations. It has not happened yet.
There is another question that's kind of related, and I'll put this question to Alina. How effective would a broadly enforced Magnitsky-style act adopted in multiple jurisdictions actually be in forcing the Kremlin's hand? In other words, would seizure of assets in foreign jurisdictions
sanctions that were first passed in the United States but have now become the global Magnitsky legislation would go a long way if more countries signed up, because what we see is that various individuals, including very likely Putin himself, hold multiple assets, offshore accounts, not just in one country, but in many countries across the world. We don't know the full extent of those assets and ownership structures, but because for that we need international cooperation, and we also need a mechanism to then, of course, be able to freeze those assets, as the question suggested, to be able to impose real consequences, personal consequences on specific individuals who steal money directly from the Russian people through embezzlement and then park them in real estate investments in London, in the United States, elsewhere across the world, in Spain, where have you. And basically, we have allowed our financial systems to become a tool of kleptocracy. And it should be the opposite of that. It should be a tool for transparency and for our ability to curb corruption and the ability of the Kremlin elite and of the system to maintain itself. So certainly if more and more countries sign up to what now is the Global Magnitsky initiative, they will go a long way in, I think, curbing some of these global kleptocratic networks and chains that support the regime in Moscow.
I have a question here. I think the best person to answer would be Mikhail Borisovich. And Mikhail Borisovich, this is I'd say, kind of a longer term question. And it's about the prospects for the Russian economy and prospects for the transition away from fossil fuels like oil and gas. And then also the economic downturn that, let's leave that off. I'm just going to ask you, because you know the oil and gas industry very well. Can Russia eventually turn away from that, from oil and gas, all of these natural resources? And would that lead to an economic downturn? Why doesn't Putin do it anyway, I would ask? He talks about an internet economy and, you know, sophistication in the digital world. Why doesn't he do that? Mikhail Borisovich?
Да. Россия, конечно, может, как и любая другая страна.
Yes, like any other country, Russia could move away from oil and gas, reduce its consumption of energy fivefold, or by replacing production or generation of a lot of energy from oil and gas and switching to nuclear generation. At the moment, large countries as Russia do not have other alternatives at the moment. If you don't believe me, look at the energy balance of such countries. What is worth doing in terms of environment is to slowly replace coal by gas. And I hope that this process is going to take place. Russia doesn't have any point in replacing gas with anything else in the nearest 50, perhaps 50 years. The question is elsewhere. What part of Russian economy is based on the production of oil and gas? And here, let's not be mistaken as far as the outside situation is concerned. The share of energy in the Russian GDP is not as big as people imagine. The share of exports of oil and gas to the West is only about 10% of the GDP in Russia. It is significant, but not critical. Where is it critical? In the federal budget, the rental income is 50+%. And this is the income that allows Putin to pretend, only to pretend, that it is him personally who is the benefactor, who benevolently distributes all the riches to different parts of society. With the dropping prices of oil and gas and Europe turning away from Russian gas and Russian oil, his opportunities are being reduced, and this is painful for him, painful. Can Putin develop new modern technologies and new industries? There are lots of Russian economists, in particular Mr. Kudrin and others, have tried many times to think up reforms that would allow the country to carry them out without political changes. At the moment, we have a consensus in Russian society. Without changing the existing political regime, it is impossible to carry out any reforms because we need new people, we need trust and confidence and communications with developed countries, and we don't have it at the moment. This regime doesn't enjoy either the first or the second and will never enjoy them.
Here's a question, and I think it's an interesting one. It's on the protests, getting back to something that I've been keeping my eye on, and I think really are significant on many levels. And President Ilves, President Ilves, could I ask you this question? So the Kremlin has been careful thus far not to go overboard in suppressing protests, especially, let's say, in Khabarovsk. This seems to affirm their belief that any confrontation with the police could spur further pushback. How do you see the prospects for further discontent if Moscow just lets the protests fizzle out?
Well, of course, Moscow does have the winter on its side, so that I mean, it's much harder to protest in the cold than when it's warm outside. Well, I've been surprised that they've actually let the Khabarovsk thing go on, and presumably not having anything come out of it really has dissipated the ardor with which people were protesting. I mean, maybe that's the tactic they will take. Of course, as soon as it becomes a genuine threat, it will be suppressed. This is the greatest fear of Putin. I mean, why he is obsessed with so-called color revolutions all along not only the perimeter of Russia, but also even elsewhere, is that popular protest is something that he cannot stand, will not abide by, and soon as it becomes big enough to actually be some kind of threat of the kind of, with the kind of massive outpouring we've seen in Belarus, it will be stifled.
Alina, I want to ask you a question. You and I actually have discussed this in terms of young people in Russia, let's say dissent among young people, and just kind of disaffection by young Russians, that a number of people are leaving. The figures vary, but there is a significant number of people, of Russians, who are simply saying goodbye to Russia, moving to other countries. And so the question here is, unlike the USSR, the borders are open, and many people who can do leave. So what if there aren't enough people left for, which probably is an exaggeration, but either a peaceful or bloody revolution? How long can the Putin system sustain itself? Obviously, I think that is an exaggeration, but what is the influence of the numbers of people who are leaving Russia?
Well, thank you, Jill, for the question. And this was also something that Mikhail Borisovich mentioned in his opening comments. The brain drain from Russia has only accelerated in some of the later years of Putin. If we even look at some Russian official numbers, which you always have to take with a grain of salt, we see an acceleration of this brain drain, basically starting around 2012 and continuing onward. What we know about these people is that they are the Russians that should be staying to build a Russian future for their society. They're often those who have technical skills so they can take elsewhere or more money elsewhere. They usually speak other languages because they move to other countries and acquire jobs there. We don't know a huge amount about them except for some anecdotal reporting. But I think what it clearly points to is that the very people who should be building a Russia that is successful, that is economically vibrant, that takes advantage of its incredible human capital resources. You know, there's the greatest irony with Russia has always been that so many Nobel laureates, known scientists tend to come from that country, yet the country itself cannot take advantage because of this system of corruption, this authoritarian autocratic regime that's been established, it cannot actually take advantage of the incredibly rich resources that it has. And so the question, if all these people are leaving, what is left behind? And I think, to me, that is the key question that we should be asking ourselves. And I think the people who are left behind tend to be those who are dependent on the state for employment. The Russian state it has grown to employ a huge number of people. The individuals don't have the resources to immigrate. Or there are those who believe and truly support, people of course support Putin and this nationalist agenda that the Russian state media and the Kremlin has been trying to propagate. Many people do support them. They don't want to leave, of course. I don't want to imply that everyone in Russia wants to leave. Of course, that's not the case. I think Russians tend to love their country like many other citizens of the world tend to love their countries. But I think, the demographic question is a serious one, because not only do you have the out-migration, but of course you've had declining fertility rates for more than one generation in Russia now. And so if we look at Russia's future as the largest country in the world, but it is sparsely populated, and the people who remain are not necessarily often those who have the kinds of human capital skills to be able to develop Russia's economic sectors. My hope is that they would stay, but of course they don't have the opportunities to be able to develop themselves, to have not just political freedoms. A lot of these people I don't think are very political, and I think Mikhail Borisovich through Open Russia has done a huge amount of work trying to understand who these people are, and I'm really curious to hear from him on that. But that has been my kind of anecdotal experience so far, and I think it spells grim stagnation for Russia's future, because they're losing the people who could build Russia into a prosperous society that it deserves to be.
Mm-hmm. Mikhail Borisovich, then I have to follow up. Alina's asking you, who are these people who are leaving? And then also I would ask one question that came up that's quite interesting about these protests. It's kind of linked. What about the growing evidence of linkage, connection between the protests across the country? So 2 questions for you.
Как вы прекрасно понимаете,
Well, you must well understand that the people who are leaving are the most active, the most dynamic, those who think that they can be successful abroad.
вы можете обратить внимание, что
You can...
рабочие места.
Can everybody hear the translation?
Да-да.
Can you hear me? Can you hear the translation?
Okay.
Yes?
I lost my... Извините, пожалуйста, я потеряла связь. Продолжайте, пожалуйста.
Не слышу.
Mikhail Borisovich, I think you can continue.
Уезжают, как вы...
The people who are leaving, as you are well aware, are those who are most active, most dynamic, most qualified. You've probably noticed that people coming from Russia, of Russian descent, in their vast majority, in other countries, take up highly qualified positions and jobs. And this is very important, because this shows, on the one hand, that Russian citizens can adapt very easily. They're no different from the rest of the world, from those who live in the West, although sometimes people are surprised by it in the West or doubt it in the West. But on the other hand, it also means that Russia loses a lot. It loses its golden fund, its golden capital. My friend, an acquaintance, by way of example, used to launch spaceship in Russia. He was one of the scientists. Until the time when he was visited by the Federal Security Service, and they started the case against him, which could easily end in charges in espionage. At the moment, he does exactly the same. He launches spaceships and satellites, but his company now resides in the Silicon Valley. And this is not the single case, unfortunately. Unfortunately, it's unfortunate for the country. It's not unfortunate for my acquaintance, because this is a good result for him. So what was the second question? I didn't quite understand. You said, what is the link about different protests? What do you mean by a link?
Among the protests that are taking place across Russia, there appears to be a connection. Perhaps that's not correct, but there have been reports that there is some type of connection.
Есть некая коммуникация.
Yes, there is some communication or connection, but this is an interesting question. But there are networks. So at the moment, our people from Open Russia, from Otkritka, visited both Minsk and Khabarovsk. In fact, some of them was very difficult to get out of Belarus. In Khabarovsk, they said that they tried to find those who had organized the protests. And they didn't find them. They did not find them. They don't exist. It was, or it is, a spontaneous protest. It just happened accidentally on social media. And similarly, the protests in Minsk. There were protests in Bashkiria. It was very similar. People came from different regions of Russia who helped the protesters and also learned from the experience. So there is interaction, not through some coordinating center, which the Federal Security Service is looking for and is dying to find, and then arrest them and put them behind bars. But it is interaction at the level of different media, social media, networks. And of course, you could arrest them all, but that would be dozens or tens of thousands of people.
Well, thank you. I once again lost my connection, which was very exciting. I was gone for a few seconds and almost had a heart attack, but I am back and very glad to say that I am. And actually, we're very close to the top of the hour. Alina, I know you said that we could go for like 5 more minutes, which would be 8 more minutes. Is it possible, very, very briefly, for our participants just to kind of wrap it up, and really briefly, because I think this has been a fascinating discussion, both short-term and long-term. So President Ilves, let's start with you. Your conclusions, заключение, and then we will go to Mikhail Borisovich, and then finally Alina.
I would say, I mean, for the overall question, will he survive, or how long will he stay? I mean, I think that if there is to be a democratic government to follow what the Putin regime, Putin still has to then, if he's alive, obviously, worry about things such as being sent to The Hague for all of his for his war crimes. I mean, for annexation of Crimea, for Donbass, for Georgia, and not to mention then all of his domestic activity. So I think that, I mean, he is really a prisoner of his position, and so he might as well stay on as the head of the mafia mob than give it up. But he will leave only if Russia remains has an undemocratic regime, because if it's a democratic regime, he has to face the consequences of his actions of the past 20 years.
And Mikhail Borisovich, I know that you've said a lot and it's very broad and actually very deep. But if there's one,
Ну,
as we say in English, takeaway, what should our
нет, ну
audience take?
чисто по-человечески я
Just
хотел...
personally, I would like Putin to live to 2024, even further, but not in his post as a president. He has got wonderful daughters. I hope grandchildren would be just as wonderful, but let him deal with his family, not with the country. I don't know what the courts would say about his sins, but I am a proponent of a peaceful resolution of a conflict, and peaceful resolution of a conflict entails some kind of immunity for its participants. If there is no chance of a peaceful resolution of the conflict, I'm afraid, as President Ilves has said, we might have a case of very tough consequences, not just for Putin, but for his entire entourage, for his closest circle. And we, even now, have to prepare ourselves for what is going to come after Putin, because it is just the question of a limited number of years. I'm 57, and even 20 years is not too long a period. But I don't believe that he's going to stay in power for another 20 years. I do not believe that.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Alina Polyakova, can you wrap up what how would you sum this up?
Well, thank you, Jill. I think I would just add from a more of a policy perspective, a point of emphasis, which is that we talk about how do we deal with quote unquote Russia, a Russia that is more aggressive, that has invaded countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, that has obviously been caught red-handed in many covert operations, poisonings, interference in our own elections in the United States and elsewhere. I think we can't forget that what we're really talking about is the Kremlin and the regime. And that if you speak to, I think anyone, I think Jill, being such a Russia expert yourself, I know you must feel the same way, that at the end of the day, what we want to achieve is the ability for the Russian people to choose their own path, the ability for them to have a future in which they have choices, political choices, of course, but choices about their economic futures as well. And those are the universal values of freedom of choice, of freedom to allow your children to have a better life than you. Those are things that I think everyone wants, no matter where we live. And I think our policies have to reflect that. So when we're talking about things like the global Magnitsky sanctions, I think those are incredibly powerful because they're targeted against specific individuals, the individuals who are producing a society in Russia that is not serving the Russian people. I think we have to keep that very much in mind when we're talking about this new era of great power competition, which has become a very common trope here in Washington, D.C., where I'm coming from today. I would just say that it's been such an honor to speak with you, Jill, and with you, Mikhail Borisovich, and with you, President Ilves. We need to have more of these kinds of long-term conversations to be more creative and thinking about what the future holds, rather than focusing on the specifics of today, which are, of course, overwhelming and important. But I think that my big question for Russia is what happens now to prepare Russian society for the inevitability of change. And change is inevitable. It may not happen in 5 years, we don't know, but it'll probably happen in the next 20 years. And a society that is mentally, politically prepared for that is really important, and we have to invest into that today. And so with that, I'll just close and on behalf of CEPA, thank all of you for this really thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you very much, Alina. And thank you to our interpreter, Yelena Cook, who was very good and very patient. Thank you to Mikhail Borisovich. Thank you to President Ilves. And thank you again, Alina. And thank you to our audience who gave some very good questions to us. I hope you'll come back. There will be many other events that CEPA will be having. And they're always on a very high level and I think very intellectually challenging. So thank you. Спасибо большое to everybody. And bye-bye.